first of all, for those that don't know, this is Kevin. Kevin and I have interacted a little bit over the years. Actually, Kevin, I'm not sure how much you know of me. I probably know more of you because I've been, man, I don't know if you remember or not, but I've been talking to you about recluse clutches and about Nikasil probably for over 10 years.
Yeah,
Back in the day when I lived in Ontario, I used to work for Lang's Off Road, so I used to talk to you then all the time.
yeah.
And then I remember when you left the industry. What year was it that you left the industry?
I left in 2021.
Okay, so you're 3 years out now.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I mean, you and I haven't interacted a huge amount besides, talking about recluse clutches and when I've sent stuff to you for Nikasil.
Yeah.
So the questions, I guess, are as much for me as for the people that are listening. Uh, just a bit of a background. I'm curious how long you were in the industry for.
So my dad has owned Mongoose since the early 90s.
Mhm.
So I spent a lot of summers working there. We didn't get the Nicasilling process until I believe it was like 94, 95. He started doing it. And even then it took a while to kind of take off. But I worked summers there while I was in high school. I worked a couple of years outside of high school, and then I'd only ever worked for my dad, so I branched out a little bit, and then eventually came back. And then I did my longest stint was about 11 years before I eventually left in 2021.
So out of high school, or well, I guess if your dad was doing basically, was he a machinist or a
Yeah,
toolmaker?
yeah, machinist.
So you've been pretty familiar with machining and tool and die and all that type of stuff like since you were a little kid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and he grew up racing, and so we always had dirt bikes. And then he used to work for GA Checkpoint, which is a local Yamaha dealer,
Yep.
prior to deciding to get into machining and then buying Mongoose.
So your dad's a bike mechanic as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
and a welder.
Yeah. Cool. That's eh, so. As far as I understand, Nikasil. I mean, even in so the late '80s, I encountered some chrome bores from Honda.
Mhm.
Have you ever run into chrome bores?
Yeah, Kawasaki still made them in their dirt bikes for probably the longest stint,
Yeah.
um, up into the 2000s. We never had the process to like re-chrome cylinders, but we would get them in. It required a different process to get the chrome off than to remove Nikasil.
Mhm.
Um, but then once it was off, you could just put Nikasil back on it. They don't have to stay chrome. That was just how they came from the factory.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I've rebuilt tons of Kawasaki's, but I did not know that they came with chrome bores.
Yeah. Um, yeah, all the two-stroke stuff used to be that way, and then I think like the KX 100 and the KX 250 probably lasted the longest,
Mhm.
coming chrome from the factory. But then after, because they were nickel everything else, they just went with one process.
So, I mean, I have tons of questions, and
Yeah,
there's this funny thing in the industry. There's communication that happens back and forth, and people are talking back and forth about Nikasil all the time. But man, it took a long time till I even understood what the process of doing Nikasil was, and I still don't have a great understanding. I mean, I understand that there's like an anode that goes in there, and there's a solution, and then the plating kind of sticks. Maybe
yeah,
you can go through kind of the process of how you put Nikasil into a cylinder.
yeah. So the Nikasil, like the actual Nikasil tank, is pretty much as you described. There's an anode that's electrified, that goes into the cylinder bore, into a solution that has nickel silicon carbide in it. And then as electricity is put through it, it kind of pulls the Nikasil out of the solution and projects it into the bore. Prior to that, though, there's a whole set of different tanks, um, of different acids, a bunch of different acids and stuff that prep the cylinder before it ever goes into that tank, at the final stage there.
So Okay, that's interesting. How like so if your dad started in 94, it's an interesting kind of mix. Like I know I'm very familiar with like machining and tool and die stuff. Like I have a lathe and I have a little milling machine here. And when I did my apprenticeship, I did lots of that stuff. But it but it's quite a jump, or maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like quite a jump from machining to dealing with like acids and chemicals and stuff. Do you remember that how your dad kind of like learned and went through that process?
Well, I mean, he was doing cylinder work already, like we were doing sleeving and boring and honing.
Yep.
And then as more and more cylinders started coming Nikasil, uh, he started looking into, okay, like if this becomes the future, because at that time he himself thought it was a better process for certain engine applications,
Mhm.
um, then it's something that he needed to be a part of or you'd get left behind. And so he didn't just sit down, go through books, and invent his own process. He actually teamed up with a company um, called Lancourt Industries. Now they're originally based out of the UK, but the owner of Lancourt came to the US and set up shop in Alabama as well. And then that's where my dad had met him through a trade show, and then they started talking, and eventually uh, he bought into that process to bring the technology to Canada. So um, the nuts and bolts of the tech came from Lancourt, and then my dad built the system that we use that used their chemicals and recipe, for lack
Mhm.
of a better word.
It's kind of crazy because there are only a few places in Canada that do it. I'm only aware of now. Basically, the only place that's left is Umatech, or what
Yeah.
used to be CVTech. I've heard that there is another place in Quebec that does it, and
Uh, yeah, I can't remember the name of them, but there is another place that does it. And when I left 3 years ago, there was a small company in Alberta that was doing it kind of out of their barn. Um, I
were
don't think
they
they could
actually
handle much
doing it, or
volume,
were
but
they?
yeah, they were actually plating.
Okay,
I
okay,
can't again. I can't remember what they were called, but there was a small company in Alberta.
okay.
He might not be around anymore.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about the differences between cast iron bores and Nikasil bores. Like, I guess we should probably leave out chrome because that didn't last very long. And I'm not sure. Well, maybe you want to talk about it, like the differences between chrome and Nikasil. But basically, I feel like a lot of the misconceptions in the industry about Nikasil come from old ideas that used to be true about cast iron bores. Would you agree with that?
Um, I don't know. It kind of depends on like what misconception you're talking about. Like they're two they're two different methods for attacking the same problem that is a cylinder. Now, cast iron. The main reason cast iron was replaced was in racing applications. It's heavy and it retains heat, so the engine just runs hotter. Uh,
Okay.
as far as getting grit and stuff in the engine, it doesn't have the same surface hardness that Nikasil does. Um, and so when using Nikasil, you're talking like the final product of Nikasil on your cylinder wall is about 5 thousandths of an inch thick versus a cast iron sleeve that is hundreds of thousands of inches thick. So um, right there, you take away all that additional material and weight, and then you leave mostly the aluminum in the cylinder, which can dissipate heat faster
Mhm.
than a cast iron bore can. So that's the big upside is weight and heat dissipation. But then it's also, like I said, it's got a higher surface hardness to it, so it can. I don't want to use the word durable, but it can take like more grit and stuff on it. But again, at 5 thousandths of an inch thick, if you catch a ring or in the force, if you drop a valve or something, it's going to go through it just the same way it would gouge a cast iron cylinder. It's going to go through the Nikasil too. But
Mhm.
against sand type grit that get into it, it does have a higher surface hardness.
The misconceptions that I continually think about and I run into in conversations with customers and people online is mainly centering around the care of Nikasil versus cast iron and also the break-in process.
Mhm.
What do you think? So, well, what would you say are some of the differences between the break-in process of cast iron versus Nikasil?
I mean, I think the overall process is very similar.
Okay.
Um, Cast iron, like I said, well, once it heats up, will stay hotter for longer. So, like warming your bike up, it is important. But mostly, like with the whole break-in, is more to, in my opinion, is more to do with just seating the rings
Okay.
than anything else. Now, the big differences between the setup, which may be some of the misconceptions that um, are deeper into what you're talking about, is like the cylinder to wall clearance, which is different between the cast iron bore and the Nikasil bore.
Mhm.
So if that's not taken into account, for example, if somebody uses the clearance spec out of a um, cast iron spec book in their Nikasil bore, then yeah, you're going to have issues because the clearance is going to be slightly different on that, and you'll seize the piston on that, regardless of how good you break it in. Um, Kind of the same thing as going from cast to forged pistons is the same problem.
Can you what's the general rule? Can you go tighter in a cast bore or tighter in a Nikasil bore? The piston clearance.
Um, Overall, you could probably go a bit tighter in the cast iron bore. Like Harleys, for example, run a thou.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
where
crazy.
I
It
say,
blew my mind when I
well,
heard that.
yeah, it's a. I was when I first started boring and honing cast for the Harley cylinders. It was the same thing. You read it and you're like, no, that can't be
Yeah,
real.
it's wrong.
But no, that's what they run. Where the average dirt bike, I would say, uses anything from, I mean, some small stuff, a thou and a half, but I'd say most cylinders run two and a half thou
Yep. That's
in a
generally
dirt bike.
what I like to see. If I can just hit a number, if I can pick a number on a 250 or 300, I'm usually setting them up around 2.5 thou.
Yeah, I don't think you go wrong with that. But again, like there is some difference between the cylinder materials, but a lot of that comes down to the piston type more than anything. And that's where like we used to see the most problems were um, like if someone doesn't send a piston or doesn't order a piston through us when they get their cylinder Nikasil, the clearance is going to be different between a cast piston and a forged piston. Now you can just go with your straight two and a half, 3 thou and call it a day. Just you'll be safe no matter what. But then it's slightly on the upper end of spec. If you want it perfect, um, then you need to know what you're using. And I mean, even knowing the material, like a cast piston is going to run a smaller clearance than a forged piston because the forged piston just expands more. Um, there's another big misconception that if I order an A piston or a B piston, they're all the same, and they're not. If you had Pro X print out 100 pistons, they're not all the same. They're going to vary by a quarter thou, up to a half thou,
Hmm.
in my experience. In which case, if you set it at two because that's the bottom spec, and it's too small by half a thou, or it's too big by half a thou, well, now your clearance is out by 33%. So,
Yeah, I have actually I've run into strange issues with, I check every single one, every single piston I put in. I check it on the way out, like with the old piston, to see what the wear is. So I can say like, okay, you got 100 hours on this piston. This is the wear. You should go longer, or you should tighten up your maintenance spec. And then I also check the piston clearance when I put the new one in. Every now and again, I'll get one that's like 1.8, and on a 250, I'm like, man, 1.8,
yeah,
that's a little sketchy. It worries
yeah.
me.
Oh, for sure. And that's why, like, again, if someone doesn't buy a piston through us or didn't back in the day, then that was fine. Um, but we need to know like what you're going to buy. And with so many retail-based customers, it's tough because they don't know. They haven't found it on eBay yet, or they don't. They're trying to find a deal on something, so they don't know
Mm-hmm.
exactly what they're putting in. But knowing what it is, it makes a big difference. And so you don't want to guess because at the same time, if you guess and you set it up, say I'll put it at three, so I don't have to worry. It's safe. It's on the upper end, but it's safe. And then somebody gets it and has somebody like you who has the ability to measure it. And I'm like, oh, well, why did they hone it to 3,000? It's way too big. Where
Mm-hmm.
it helps to have the piston with you. It's just not everybody sends them or thinks
Yeah,
it's important.
I imagine like I've talked to a lot of different engine builders over the years, and I've seen there's patterns, right? It seems to me like the moto guys, they want to go they don't mind going a little bit bigger on their ring end gap, but they're always, it seems like they're trying to go tighter on the piston clearance, because it seems to me that they're going for horsepower at high RPM.
Yeah.
And then the woods guys that are building engines for the woods, they're not as they seem to be generally not as concerned about piston clearance, but they want to keep the ring end gap pretty small.
Yeah. I mean, the moto guys wanting the clearance tighter has always been that way. And I mean, everything, especially machining, everything's a compromise. You're going to gain something somewhere, but you give up something else. And so you do run the risk that if they haven't warmed it up properly, if they haven't seated the rings properly, you can seize it just by running it at such a high temperature for so long. But yes, out on a dyno, you're going to produce more horsepower.
So one of the things, well, let's dive into that term, seating the rings, because it's such a common term. I hear it all the time, and you'd be hard pressed to find anybody, even in the industry, that can tell you exactly what that means. And yeah, I guess let's talk about, let's just hear what you think, what's the definition, what does that mean, seating rings, and how do you go about it?
So, like when you hone a cylinder, especially Nikasil, because you have to use diamond stones to do it, you're doing it to get the crosshatch, which is there to provide oil retention.
Okay.
But when you're done honing it, that crosshatch is sharp. And so when you get the rings in there, they kind of have to break into the cylinder or seat in the cylinder, which is kind of finding their place to run up and down. And then also, there's not even pressure on the whole cylinder. The piston is always pushed forwards and backwards on the rod. So you're going to get, when you're done with the cylinder, or sorry, not when you're done, when someone takes the engine apart after they run it, the cylinder is no longer round, it's oval. Not by any great degree, but if you
I
measure it,
see
it's
half a
oval.
thou all the time.
Yeah. And so that's just kind of making sure the rings are seated in that position where as it runs. So
Okay.
that's why when people take a piston out of the cylinder and either get a B piston or even just put new rings in it, um, if you don't hone it when you do that, you put them back in, you now have an oval cylinder running with circular rings. And so you're going to have gap there
Hmm.
until eventually the rings do seat into even that position. But it just causes, again, it's minute, but it's not perfect.
Okay, I think that's probably a really important distinction there, because you get everybody online from guys that, they'll send their cylinder in to get diamond honed every time that they put a piston in. The guys that are really kind of anal about what they're doing, racing moto or whatever, to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, guys that kind of clean up their cylinder with some brake clean and then throw a new piston in it and put it back together. And it's kind of like discussing politics and religion. It's really hard to nail down good, consistent evidence back and forth, because you get such a broad swath of stuff that works. You get half the people say, "I'll just put it back together and it works. I've never had a problem." And then the other half of the people are like, "Oh, no, 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 you can't do that." But all the engines tend to work. So I feel like this is really where there's two kinds of discussions. There's like the technically correct discussion, like you say, it might be, the differences might be minute, but for the average guy, how important is it to be thinking about that ring break in in a Nikasil bore, or how important is it to put new crosshatch in your cylinder for the average guy working in his garage?
I mean, in my background, I'm going to say like you need it because that's what it needs to be perfect. But in reality, no. You can get away with a lot of things. Again, you're back into that compromise where you not have to pull the cylinder off or and have it honed before you put in a new set of rings or a new piston. You're going to save yourself some money, but you are giving up something on the other end. It's now no longer perfect. You're running a worn cylinder with rings that are brand new, which is going to cause it to wear oddly because they're now not touching everywhere at the beginning. But can you get away with it? Sure. It's the same as an oil change. The manual tells you you need to do it it's every so many hours. Could you go an extra 3 hours? Absolutely. Is that
Mhm,
good for it? No, it should be changed. But in most situations, is it going to cause you a problem? Probably not.
mhm. And this is
I'm
something
just
that I
going to
also,
pause for 1 sec. That I can see the light coming through
yeah,
my blinds. So I'm just going to shut them.
sure, yeah,
There.
there we go.
That's better.
That's better. Yeah, yeah. I
So I
think
mean, it's more of a what's perfect. Like, what should you do? Like, buy the book to make this back to being as perfect as you can versus what could you do to just get by? And a lot of guys will just get by. A lot of woods riders aren't hard on the engine. They're not running it at a high RPM for extended periods of time, so it'll probably be fine. Uh, but it's going to cause excess wear somewhere else.
yeah, that and that's I think that's fair. That's something that I try to try to keep in mind all the time. Like, there's always a spectrum. Like you say, there's you give in one area, you're going to get a little bit more, and vice versa. What's practical for this customer may not be practical for this customer. So for the average guy in his garage who wants to do the best job that he can, I mean, I'm aware that there are multiple different ways that you can hone a cylinder. Now, with cast iron, my concern is like I'm probably more careful with honing cast iron than I am with Nikasil because I know the Nikasil is so hard and I don't have a diamond hone, and I've experimented enough with honing that I know that if I hone for a long, long, long time, I might get a tenth of a thou out of the Nikasil with my aluminum oxide stones. So, what would you say is a practical way for somebody at home to maintain their cylinder when they're doing a top end?
I mean,
Would you
with the
recommend
Nikasil,
honing at all, or just clean it up and put it back in?
I mean, for the average guy, it's going to be tough because to really check whether you need that done, you're going to need a dial bore gauge, which not everybody's going to have, and nobody wants to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a tool that only does that one thing.
Yep.
Um, the tough thing with Nikasil is because the surface hardness is so high to effectively hone it, you need diamond stones. With there are other ways to kind of go in there and hone it with other materials, like what you were discussing, and some of them do work a little bit. But like you said, if you leave it in there for a long, long time, you get a tenth out, but you're not really honing it. You're just polishing it, and you're taking away not not always, but you're starting to take away the crosshatch in it, and that's where you're getting that the extra space from. And
Hmm.
so you are making it slightly bigger, which is what overall you're trying to do, but you're doing it at the expense of a crosshatch, which is designed for oil retention. So you're giving up something else to get that the extra little bit of room to effectively hone it to bring your clearance back to spec. Um, Outside of diamond stones, there really isn't anything that effectively hones Nikasil. Um, And again, it's a tough thing for the end consumer because when you maybe just need a quick little flash home to get this back to being perfect, nobody's going to spend $90,000 on a automotive hone. And then I think the diamond stones that go in each hone head are like 2 grand a piece, and you're looking at 6 stones there. So
Yeah.
there's a reason shops have to charge so much. Like I know people get used to get upset with the cost of honing, but the equipment behind it is hugely expensive, and that's where the cost comes from. Um, Ball hones are the same thing in a four stroke. Um, they do work. You just have to be really, really good at it, and that's I think one of the tools that the average guy will go by and not really know what they're doing, and then they run into problems because you'll flare the cylinder out by pulling it out too far one way or the other.
Mhm.
Um, People with more experience can use them very effectively, but it's one of those tools that anybody can purchase, but they shouldn't.
That's probably a key right there. I think I'll probably cut that out for a little Instagram thing. Like it's something that people should buy, but they could buy, but they probably shouldn't. Um, so in a lot of this type of stuff, like I say, there's kind of the when you learn building engines and any craft really, there's kind of two ways that I see most people come about it. One way is kind of from the engineering perspective, from a theoretical knowledge base, and then there's another perspective from a like a practical, like the way that I learned. I did an apprenticeship, and I just copied what my mentor did, and I've modified that over the years. But I find a lot of guys really kind of get set in their ways after the first couple of years. They learn from their mentor, and their mentor doesn't always. Mentors often say do this, but they don't say why you should do this. And so we get all these guys in the industry that are really set in their ways, and they just use kind of sound bites to explain why they're doing what they're doing. And I can't say that I'm any different. you know, Even though I did my apprenticeship at a place where we had a full machine shop, we were boring cylinders and building cranks and, all that stuff, basically everything except for doing Nikasil. It was still from a perspective of like, well, this has worked and I've had problems with this, so we do it this way.
Uh-huh.
So with honing or deglazing, and that's another thing that we might want to talk about. With a ball hone, in my experience, what I've seen is a ball hone, you can get pretty aggressive with a ball hone. With one of those cheap 3-stone spring hones, like a brake hone kind of a thing, with a flat stone, it seems like it's not quite as aggressive. So if I got a cylinder that's like maybe got some scoring or something, it seems like it's more effective to use a ball hone, because after I hone it, and I'm careful with it, with the crosshatch, you know,
Uh-huh.
angle and everything. Who knows? Yeah, I can't really say if I've been doing it right or not, because there's so much conflicting information. But with a straight hone, then I can see what I like about a straight hone is I can see, where the cylinder has been worn, and that gives me a good indication of where it's worn and how much it's worn. And also, I like it that it's not as aggressive, because like I can put a little bit of crosshatch back in. I don't know how deep that crosshatch goes, but it gives me a really good indication about how damaged the cylinder is. What do you
Yeah.
think about that? Like the differences between a ball hone, how practical is it for the average guy at home? Should the average guy be using a ball hone or one of those 3-stone spring hones, or like a pressure hone with aluminum oxide stones? What do you think? Or
I
should
mean,
they just stay away from it altogether?
I think the average person should stay away altogether.
Okay.
I don't think that there's nothing particularly wrong with any one of those methods, but it's seat time. Like how much time have you spent using that? And that's
Mhm.
the problem is when you're doing it for your own bike, you're going to hone it once a year, maybe once every 2 years. Well, you have no idea what you're doing.
Yeah.
Where even someone like yourself, whether you're using a ball hone or a 3-stone hone or whatever, you're seeing way more cylinders than the average person is going to in their lifetime. So you have more seat time in using those tools and perfecting those tools. Um, and then when you take it a step further to the machine shop, like I know, depending on the cylinder, like how big the bore is, um, the hone heads that we had would hold 5 to 6 stones. And there you're just, the more you can have in there, the more even it can stay. The hone heads we have different springs in them than those 3-spring hones, so it's giving even pressure all the way around. And so it's keeping it more perfect. The other thing it does is uh, with the automotive hone machine setup, it kind of dummy proofs it. Like you can set bottoms and tops, and so the hone head will only run in those positions.
Mhm.
Where with the ball hone or the 3-stone hone on a drill, you
Oh
have
yeah.
to watch what they're doing. And again, someone who does that once or twice a year has no idea what they're
Mhm.
doing.
Yeah, I what you're saying is exactly right. Like especially with a 3-stone hone, man, if you go just a little bit too far, especially on a two-stroke. I remember like the old CR 250s or the 3-wheelers. they had that weird kind of T-shaped port, and they're almost
Yeah.
impossible. Like they're almost impossible to hone. The another term that's constantly used is deglazing. So, what is the difference? What is deglazing? What is glazing? And what's the difference between deglazing and honing? Or
I
is it
think
just a term that means the same thing?
80% of the time when somebody says deglazing, they mean honing. The terms get used interchangeably the bulk of the time. Um, as a piston, if you get grit in there or something, and some piston material can come off in the cylinder just from rubbing on it, and kind of clogs up the crosshatch. Then people say, "Oh, it's glazed. You can feel it's all polished, smooth again." So deglazing, in my opinion, is when people would go in with different types of acid, and try to get out the aluminum that's stuck in the crosshatch there to get the crosshatch back and deglaze. And I know someone else is probably going to message on here and say, nope, that's not what it means. It means this.
Yeah.
And there's a multitude of actual meanings to what that is. But I'd say the vast majority of people, when they say deglaze, they mean home.
Okay, so deglazing is it would be like there's material that's built up in the cylinder wall that you need to
Yeah.
remove. And you could do that with something like muriatic acid,
Yeah.
or
You
you
can
could
do it.
technically do it with a hone as well. You could
Yes.
do it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
Specifically with Nikasil, because the diamond stones are going to take out the aluminum way faster than they take out the Nikasil. So you can do it effectively. We've when I say we, like in the machine shop, we've never used any acids to try to accomplish that. We would just hone it, and if we couldn't accomplish it with honing, then we would tell you need to replate your cylinder.
mhm,
Again, from the machine shop standpoint, and I know some people always think that they're being screwed over by a shop or whatever. Our job is to make it perfect. Because same thing with you, when you put out a product, there's a warranty behind it, or at least your name behind it. So you
yeah.
want it to be perfect. And could you get away with less? Sure. Am I going to advise that? Absolutely never, because I don't want to have to stand behind that comment. And so, will muriatic acid work? Yes. Would I ever tell someone to do that? No.
Yeah, yeah. I don't even have muriatic acid in my shop right now. I do like to keep it around because I use it for cleaning the carbide burrs on my Fordham tool.
Yeah.
They get all the burrs get all stuck full of aluminum, and
Mm-hmm.
man, you just like stick them in a little glass with muriatic acid, and the aluminum just disappears.
Yep.
But yeah, I don't like to have it on my bench because all my bench tops are steel, and if you have a container of it open for more than a few minutes, like the whole bench, like there's like a big circle
Yeah.
of rust that happens.
I mean, there's different acids for everything. Like in like the plating process, they use nitric acid because it eats Nikasil but doesn't eat aluminum. I mean, if you leave it in there long enough, yeah, it'll wreck it. But um, that's how they get the Nikasil off.
Oh, okay. So you so to get the Nikasil off, you just submerge it and it comes off, and you do that instead of like cutting it out with a boring bar or something.
Yeah, so we do it other than or without using the boring bar, because if you use a boring bar, the plating's anywhere from 2.5 to 5 thou thick, maybe 6 thou in some cases. So to get that off, you're gonna have to cut bigger, and depending on how the cylinder wore, it's thinner in some spots than others. So you're gonna have to cut maybe 10 thou out. Well,
Mm-hmm.
now not only do you have to put on the 5 thou worth of plating, you got to plate 10 thou back on to make up that difference. And the thicker you go with the plating, the more fragile it becomes. It'll get ripped off the cylinder easier the thicker it is. So
Mm-hmm.
you don't want it to go on thick.
That's interesting. Back in the day when I was doing my apprenticeship, I had a YZ 250, and we were doing a big bore in it, 2 millimeters over, and the idea was because we bored cylinders all the time. The idea was we figured, okay, well, let's we bored out the Nikasil and did all the porting and everything, and cut the power valve back, did all that stuff ahead of time.
Uh-huh.
And the thought process was, well, let's go, just a couple thou bigger on the bore so that we get more Nikasil so it'll be stronger.
Yeah, and No, that's not the case. That as
Yeah.
you get thicker and thicker and thicker, and again, you could probably go like multiple thou bigger, and it's really not. It'll be problem on paper, but not in reality. But the
Mhm.
thicker you go with it, the easier it can detach from the plating. Because if you, as the piston's going up and down and putting pressure on it, it can be peeled away easier if it's thicker.
Like it'll flake off.
Yeah.
That's another interesting thing. So I've had Nikasil done all over the place. I've used US Chrome, Millennium, Umatech, obviously Mongoose, and the Nikasil seems to look very similar, except for at
Mhm.
US Chrome. And I have no interest in calling out US Chrome or anything. It looks quite alarming, although there's like porosity, but big, like you can kind of catch it with your fingernail, and it looks alarming. What do you think about that?
Like you mean like pits in it?
Oh yeah, there's pits like you can, and there's a lot, and you can see them.
So the reason that plating costs what it costs is it from by how many hands have to touch it to go through the entire process of getting that cylinder in to when it goes back out. And depending on the um, quality control that each business has, and I'm not going to call out anybody. I've seen US Chrome; they've done good work. I'm
Yep.
sure they've done bad work, same as anybody, any company. But as you use nitric acid to get off the Nikasil, depending on how many times that cylinder has been plated, it's sat in nitric acid multiple different times. It can start to eat away at the cylinder. You can also have, I haven't really seen it in a dirt bike in a long time, but the Arctic Cat uh, snowmobile cylinders that were made by Suzuki back in the day was not the grade of aluminum that their Yamaha or Polaris or Skidoo counterparts were using to make the cylinders. And so as you heat it up, or as the engine gets used, oil can absorb into the aluminum if it's not solid. And so when you heat it up to go through the plating process, the oil explodes and you end up with all these little pits. Now, as you put it through the different acids, it can also expose those pits in it. Um, Now, in most situations, in my experience, you would go in there, you would bore it out bigger, weld up those areas, rebore it back to what it should be, and then plate it. Just because the pits look really bad, and by and large, it's not going to hurt anything as long as a ring can't get stuck on it.
Hmm.
You're probably fine, but yeah, it looks bad.
Yep. Yeah, and it's so I had my YZ250 replated by US Chrome, many years ago, and I got it back, and I was like, "Whoa! Like, what's wrong?" I called, and they were like, "Yep, it's normal, cool, don't worry about it." I ran it. Uh, I had issues with it, but it was for a totally different reason. Nothing wrong with the porosity in the plating. And last year, I I had a cylinder here that somebody supplied, brand new from US Chrome, and it had that pitting in it. And the cylinder came with a note that said, "Yep, it's possible that there's going to be pitting or porosity in the cylinder. It's all good. Don't worry, no problem." And I've built a bunch of motors with
Yeah,
Chrome with Nikasil like that, and never an issue that I could ever relate to that type of thing. It just
yeah, and if
looked.
they're pinhole pits, you're probably never going to see an issue.
Yep.
If the pits get too big, then you do run the risk that the ring can catch on it. Um, and sometimes you'd strip off the plating from the factory, and they would have pits just underneath it that they had put on more plating than they needed to try to fill those pits, but they were just there. Once you get this Nikasil off, you realize, oh, there's all these pits in it that are nobody's fault, but now they exist, and unless you
Hmm.
go in there and either fill them with plating again, which is difficult because you have to put it in for a really long time, um, or you're grinding them and welding them and reboring them. Um, you also run into that issue when you do have a two-stroke or four-stroke, but mostly two strokes that get gouged, catch a ring or something. We have to weld it up. So you weld it all, and if the weld isn't perfect, and even for someone who is amazing at it, it can end up not being perfect. You bore that weld back flush with the cylinder, and there's a pit in it because you're trying to attach the aluminum rod that you're using to the aluminum of the cylinder. Now you have to weld it, rebore it again, weld it, rebore it again, and like with the Articat Suzuki cylinders, um, sometimes you'd have to do this 6, 7 times. Um,
Wow.
and there again is why the plating process, the plating costs so much, is the process of getting it, cleaning it, baking out all the oil, stripping the Nikasil off, prepping it again. It goes through a multitude, probably 8 or 9 different tanks before it ever hits the plating process. If it's gouged, you have to weld it, bore it, hone that back to the size you want to start with, plate it, get that out, hone it, chamfer the ports. It's a process. The man hours are huge.
It seems fraught with the opportunity for failure.
Uh,
And like there so I talked to the guys that bought the all the machine shop stuff from Mongoose, and they seem like great guys. Like they seem he was so I was so impressed that he was very upfront, and he was like, okay, we've done a batch of 10 cylinders. We still have to finish hone them. In a few months we should be kind of taking orders, but he was very open about the fact that they were actively going through a learning process with this whole Nikasil thing. And that really it was confidence inspiring, because anybody who goes in to a process like doing Nikasil and is just overconfident, is like, oh yeah, we'll just take a bunch of orders and then see how it goes. I mean, that seems like a really, really dangerous thing to do.
yeah, I mean, even when my dad started, the guy that he had worked with the process on from Lancourt, he came up and helped for a bit. I can't remember how long, in setting things up. But then you're kind of just left to eventually start doing cylinders and seeing how things go. My dad had spent months beforehand buying up old cylinders and spent months after that plating and replating before we ever touched a customer's cylinder,
Yeah.
because it is huge. Like if you make a mistake in one of the steps along the way, um, you have problems. If you accidentally grab the cylinder with your bare hands, your thumbprint on the inside of the bore, the oils in your hand, would cause the plating not to stick to it. So you'd have a patch where there was no plating. Like there's
Really?
just, like you said, there's so much opportunity for a mistake to occur.
It's that
Um,
sensitive, like a
oh
thumbprint.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And then the different tanks that it goes into, it's not a matter of just dip it in this tank, rinse it in water, dip it in this tank. This acid goes in for 38 seconds, and then the next one you go in for 46 seconds. The next one you go in for a minute, and as you continue to use these acids, they get weaker. Well, you have to recognize that. So, okay, instead of 38, now we're doing 42, and you have to be able to do this on the fly, because if you go too far out of that range, it'll cause problems. The Nikasil won't stick properly, won't go on properly. Um, if you run the amperage too high on the machine, because when the Nikasil comes out, it's not smooth and that like dipping in chrome, and then you just hone it. It comes out like sandpaper, and so then you have to hone off all these little ridges and nubs, um, that make up the sandpaper appearance to it. But if you run the amperage too high, those sandpaper bumps get bigger, like magnified, and so now you have to go in there with a diamond uh, Dremel and grind all that stuff out of the ports. Anywhere that there's a 90 degrees, the Nikasil builds up more, so you have to anticipate that in certain areas. Um, it's
So it's
huge.
like
Like
it's a highly skilled, like, it's not something that you can just like give to somebody and say do these things. Like, you can't just like write out a procedure. It's
I mean,
very.
you do have a procedure manual, but it's
Yeah,
filled with asterisks. Like
yeah,
if this starts happening, or if the plating comes out, you take out a cylinder and the color looks like this, that means this is starting to go. Now you have to stop, go back, strip that off, adjust the times here, here, and here, and then go again.
yeah.
Um, and over time, my dad did a great job at building that manual and building an Excel um, calculator that you would enter in the different dimensions of the cylinder and the type of cylinder, and it would spit you back out a range of time in the Nikasil tank, a range of time in this tank, and kind of give you the best bet for getting that done. But the person doing it also had to pay close attention. Um, and unless you have one guy who's just solid at doing a multitude of things, again, what drives the price up on plating is you have a plater, you have a welder who welds damaged cylinders, you've got a guy on the boring bar who can also bore aluminum. Um, if it's a two-stroke and someone took out a port, you're not just welding up that port, or Yamaha with the exhaust bridge. You have to weld it all back up, reshape it back to the shape it's supposed to be,
Mhm.
um, and deal with all of that. So there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of people got to touch that cylinder.
It amazes me that, well, I guess that's the reason why there's only, a couple of people across North America, a couple of companies across North America that can do it. Because there's so many. I mean, imagine having you must have run into it. Like you must have tried teaching guys over the years how to do it, and then have them be there for 2 years and then leave, and then how do you replace that guy? That's
Yeah, it's really really difficult. I mean, COVID was bad too because not everybody came to work, or people got sick a lot and they had to be out. So you're working constantly. Um, but I mean, everybody across multitude of industries, but primarily the power sports industry, um, feels the gravity of the current work labor force market, and people don't stick around like they used to. People don't have the knowledge or the drive to obtain the knowledge to do all this stuff. It's different than it used to be. And so yeah, it's
yeah,
hard. And like you said, that's why you only see a handful of companies doing it. Is the cost of plating is huge.
yeah,
The margins on it are small, but from a business standpoint, it's kind of the a loss leader, for lack of a better term. I doubt anybody's losing money at it, but that plating that cylinder means you may get a piston sale, you may get a gasket sale. If they're sending you the cylinder, they also are going to send you the crank because they don't want to send them to two different places. So you may get that. On a four stroke, you might get the head with it. So it opens up all these other avenues where you may make better margins, but the plating itself um, had the highest internal cost than any other
wow,
service that we offered.
that's crazy to think that the Nikasil itself is actually or like kind of borderline like a lost leader. That that's pretty intense. For something that is that skill intensive, and something that is so rare for somebody to do, to have the skill to do. That's got to be really frustrating to have all that equipment and all of that procedure. Like that procedure manual must have been pretty fat,
Yeah.
and to have it just be there so that you can sell pistons and build cranks.
I mean, like when you say, or when I say lost leader, is not just breaking even on itself. All the people's like hourly wages factored into that, so it's paying for them to be there. You're keeping people employed. You're keeping your staff on hand because that boring guy is not just boring Nikasil cylinders. He's boring sleeve jobs and rebores, and they're
Mm-hmm.
doing other things. But yeah, by and large, from a margin standpoint, the plating had the tightest margins for services.
Yeah, that's. I mean, now, so myself, I'm just when I do an engine and I send out a cylinder for plating, it's $500, and that includes shipping. And really, for me as well, like I've thought about raising the price, but I think customers would probably get upset if I did, because they could send. I think it's just an optics thing, because they could send a cylinder to Umatech and get it replated, and the cost of getting it replated is something like $370 or something. I don't know
Mhm.
exactly what it is right now. That's a retail price. Is you're sub $400 for the actual price of doing the Nikasil, but then shipping it is you know well, I try to combine. I usually ship, two, three, four cylinders at once, and I can make a little bit that way. But if I'm shipping one cylinder to ship it to Quebec, and I always put insurance on it, because if I don't, Canada Post is going to lose it. So it costs me, $50 to ship a cylinder there, and it costs, 40, $50 to ship it back. So I might make $30 on that $500 transaction.
Yep.
But man, people, I don't know if, I mean, maybe I can charge more. I don't know, but there's
I mean,
certainly no money in it.
No, that's the. I mean, that's always been a struggle in power sports. Worse now, in my opinion, than in the past. But when you compare what someone like yourself does versus an automotive mechanic who reassembles engines, well, if you're putting together an F-150, it's going to be pretty similar to the Ram 1500 or something else, where doing power sports, you're working on dirt bikes and street bikes and quads and UTVs and trikes and from five different eras of machining. Um, your knowledge base is, in my opinion, drastically bigger than an automotive mechanic.
Mhm.
Yet you can't charge the same hourly rate that an auto mechanic does just because the car is a need and a bike is a want. And the tough thing with a want industry is that when times are bad, it's the first thing they go, and people will complain about prices and people will complain about a multitude of things. But it doesn't negate the fact that all the experience, all the knowledge that you have, all the tools you've had to buy to be able to offer the services that you do are
Mhm.
huge. Um, and
I feel like
that's an uphill battle the power sports industry has, unfortunately.
I feel like, I mean, I've carved out a pretty good niche for myself. Like I work on strictly dirt bikes, and that's going to change soon. I'm building a shop and stuff, and so that's going to change. But um, I feel like a big advantage, and I saw this when I worked at a dealership, was okay. The dealership, this guy works on BRP, this guy works on KTM, and before that, I thought, working at a small shop, I thought, man, that's kind of lame. Why would you specialize in one thing? Like I want to be able to fix anything. But once I saw the efficiency that comes from really honing in and specializing on your craft, it really became clear to me. And man, I love working on dirt bikes. I don't like working on things that are covered with cow shit. Like, so, so I just don't do it. Um, but I see lawn and garden shops. I don't know how they even survive because they're working on a piece of equipment that's worth $150 for a weed whacker. And the tech, like, what can you do? What can a tech do in under an hour by the time that the tech goes and grabs the unit and then diagnoses the unit and then repairs the unit, tests the unit, and fills out the work order? What can you do in under an hour? What can you do
Yeah,
in less time than that machine is worth?
yeah, I agree. Um, and I don't know what the answer is. There's guys that do it, so they must feel like they make money,
Yeah.
or maybe it just keeps the lights on. I don't know, but I agree with you. Diagnosing is the worst part of our industry or any industry because it sometimes is a crapshoot. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but taking the time to run through and diagnose stuff, you can't make money at it. And so I can see why some people specialize because then you get to know that particular type of machine better.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for someone who does try to open up and do like all the brands of dirt bikes, like what you're talking about, um, and there's a lot of similarities between like a cylinder on a KTM is very similar to a cylinder on a Japanese bike. The ports are all different and stuff changed, but what always jumped out to me was power valves. You could be a KTM tech and you could assemble any KTM power valve you want, but the YZ power valve is different.
It's
An
the
older
worst.
Cowie or like an early 2000s Honda power valve, good
Mm-hmm.
luck. I hate those things.
Yeah, you
So
put
many
on
little things.
Hondas, you put the cylinder on it, it breaks the little tab off
Yeah,
if you don't have it lined up correctly.
yeah.
And the Kawasaki ones, I like with those little
The
gears,
little
like
gears, like the spine gears.
yeah, with the little dots on them.
Yeah,
I saw so many of them where like you line up all the dots and then you look in the exhaust port and one of the little finger ports, the auxiliary exhaust ports, is opening a lot sooner than the other one and one's half open.
yeah,
I ran into that with Kawasaki's all the time where you have to not line up the dots in order to make the sub exhaust ports open the same.
yeah. And that's like where we used to always struggle because we would offer to reassemble people's power valves. But if they didn't send it as part of the cylinder, they took it out and just sent you a bag of power valve parts.
Yeah.
And we would have different, we had a whole catalog of part speeches that show the exploded view, and that helps a lot.
Mhm.
But if you have a tech who hasn't seen everything and you're paying him, you charge a generalized rate to assemble a power valve. Well, if he makes two or three mistakes along the way, that's triple the time. Or,
Yep.
like I said, the early 2000s CR 125 and CR 250, we just straight up charged more because there was so many little components you're try to hold on to at the same time you assemble a secondary piece. It it was just insane.
Yeah.
But a generalized tech or mechanic has to know or be able to figure that out, which again just comes from knowledge and experience, which makes it hard to justify why you're charging so much more because you gained all that experience.
Yeah, I remember when I started. So after my apprenticeship, during my apprenticeship, I worked mostly on Japanese stuff, and then I started working on mostly Austrian stuff. Well, a lot of betas, Shurkos, and KTM's basically. And at first I thought, oh, these KTM power valves are so weird. Now I can probably reassemble a KTM power valve in like 15 minutes. But man, the Yamaha ones, man, they have so many more components and all the little springs and washers and stuff. And then you always get one in the wrong spot.
Yeah,
Um, but I think it's hard for a lot of people with dirt bikes to understand. Okay, sometimes I'm gonna take 15 minutes to reassemble your power valve, but I'm gonna charge you an hour
yeah,
because there's a lot of other little things that I'm doing along the way before that I reassemble the power valve, after I reassemble the power valve. Now, I guess, yeah, it's hard for people to understand all of the other little things that surround it. And then every now and again, I'm going to get one that bites me, and it's going to take me 3 hours to assemble it because I got to get in there with a burr and I got to remove some Nikasil in order to make it function. And every time that I assemble a power valve, I throw a ring down the cylinder to check for the check power valve
yeah.
clearance and you know all the stuff that just goes with it, checking the piston clearance, grinding the rings. Lately, like the past year, I have to grind almost every set of rings that I put in. I never used to have to do it. I don't.
In the last little while that I was at Mongoose, we noticed the same thing that we were having to went from using our ring grinder
Oh, interesting.
4 or 5 times a month to at least once a day. Um, and I don't know what the cause is, whether it's just higher or larger tolerances coming out of the ring manufacturers or what. But we did find the same thing that you're having to gap more rings than you didn't,
Interesting.
which was not the way it had been for the previous decade.
I haven't heard anybody else say that, but it's like, man, I check every set of rings, and I've done it forever. I don't know what the factor is, but yeah, it's cool to hear somebody else say it. Like I've noticed this too, that I'm not the only one. I
Yeah, we had to start adding it as a charge towards the end of my time there because before you tell people we checked it, but you checked it and you never had to grind one, so it was not really a cost. You were just checking it.
Yeah,
But now you're having to do all these ones. Like, okay, like we're gonna have to add a labor charges because you're spending so much time grinding rings.
yeah,
But I think like to what you're saying about being able to assemble a power valve in 15 minutes and charging hours with the labor, and we had to go through the same thing, and people get upset about it, and you don't want to be rude to people and you don't want to be mean, but you sometimes you had to say like, do you want me to get somebody who doesn't know what they're doing? Because they'll take an hour, and if that makes you feel better about spending the hours with the labor,
hmm
then great, I'll get this guy who doesn't know what he's doing, and he'll do it for you. If
yeah,
you want me to do it, it would with my level of expertise, the amount of experience that I've accumulated, I'm going to
yeah,
charge you the hour because that's what it should cost because I'm going to do it faster because I'm good. So what's going to make you
yeah.
feel better about spending that hours with the labor?
And so many times, you know, well, every now and again, I can do one in 15 minutes, but so many times it's like, oh, I have to grind the rings. Oh, I have to take a little lick off of the power valve.
Yeah.
So, you get some of them that are faster and some of them that are slower. But I think there's value to just assigning, like saying, okay, I'll charge you an hour for this job. And that way you can quote. And man, people love it when you just come in and you quote and you just stick to your quote. And it
Oh,
doesn't matter.
100%.
Doesn't matter if you take an hour and a half. I'm still charging an hour.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I think that's the, I mean, I think you hit on the biggest point right there. If you have the ability, whether your price is too high or not, if you can quote a price and that guy comes in and pays the price that you quoted him at the beginning,
Mhm.
that has tremendous value, and customers, that's the biggest appreciation. Nobody likes to get hit with additional costs,
No.
and unfortunately that is the case sometimes. Something's different, um, because the tolerances on dirt bikes is so much tighter than automotive or snowmobiles or anything larger, outboards. um, you do run into one-offs where, like, yes, they can cast 3,000 YZ250 cylinders in a year, but not every one of those casts is identical, and the tolerances are so tight that sometimes that matters. Um, and that's different than most other industries, and it makes it like Mongoose has a, or when my dad had Mongoose, they had a home that was very computerized, so you could go in and set all these programs that, oh, it's a CR250, and you're supposed to be able to hit and go and just walk away. Well, not
Mhm.
every CR250 is exactly the same height, or the power valve is in exactly the same spot. And so, unlike automotive, which is what all these machines were designed for, um, you never felt confident where you could just hit and go, walk away for lunch, and come back, and that the
Yeah.
cylinder would be perfect. And that's something else that just unfortunately adds to the cost of power sports machining or mechanic or whatever, is that everything is kind of a one-off.
Mhm.
Yes, they're the same, but like you said, you could assemble 100 YZ250 power valves. One of them's going to hit the piston. You're going to have to go in there and machine it. Why
Yep.
is that? They're all the same cylinder, but they just, the tolerances are too tight
Yeah, I hear
because
so
everything's
many,
so precise.
like I see a lot of comments. I get this a lot in comments. Is uh, I outline an issue that I see periodically, and a lot of times somebody in the somebody in the comments will invariably say, "I've never had an issue." Okay, well, I've done. I don't. I sometimes I wish I would have kept track of how many pistons I have installed in motorcycle engines. It's got to be in the thousands over the last, you know, over the last 12 years, 13 years. It's got to be in the thousands. Um, but the sheer scale of somebody who puts pistons in bikes every day, and not only that, I'm in constant contact with guys like yourself. You know, what are the issues that you've seen with this motor? What are the issues that guy's seen with this motor? What are the issues that guy's seen with this motor? And we build a knowledge base as a community. This happened with the TPIs. They were such a novel thing, and the whole world was on this learning curve, and everybody was like sharing information, and we learned faster as a group. And the if we didn't have that group, it would be almost impossible to to get jobs done in. I mean, I'm not saying it's efficient now, but it's a really big, like, it's a big snowball that's rolling down a hill, and if you're not part of that snowball, man, it's really hard to do things efficiently.
For sure. And I think one of the things that those of us who have spent time in power sports industry love so much is that, by and large, if you're in that industry, you're an enthusiast to a degree. And so there is more willingness to share information and be a group rather than against each other,
Hmm.
um, because it's a passion for the bulk of
Almost
us.
all of us.
Yeah, and it makes the industry unique. It makes it tough because I found you, I wouldn't say taken advantage of, but you're more easily willing to give up your time for free because you understand where that person's coming from. I don't want to ruin someone's weekend. I don't want to delay your camping trip. If I have to work an hour and a half of overtime to make sure that cylinder's done for Friday so you can get your kids' bike together, I'm going to do it because I feel bad.
Absolutely.
Where in
I
other
feel
industries,
that
they don't
every
have that.
day.
And it's what makes the industry what it is, but it also is, in my opinion, a huge hurdle to overcome because it does make it progressively harder to make money in this industry because people kind of expect that they can get a deal, or I've done 4 bikes with you in the past, I should get a discount. And that's not really the way it works, and especially when it's labor, because that's your time. What you're asking me to do is discount my life. Like
Mhm.
my life is time spent doing these things, and rarely in any other industry, nobody goes to Amazon and says, "I want a better deal on this because I bought 5 cell
Yeah.
phone cases this year."
Yeah.
You just suck it up and pay it. But for some reason in power sports, people are more willing to grind you on things like that. I found, and it was always one thing that irked me about the industry, but at the same token, I loved it. So I loved the industry. So you're willing to give away more of your time because you love it.
Yeah, I think and it's another thing that I've thought about a lot is, you know, I'm a one man show at the moment, and most of my time in the industry has been spent working at a small shop where somebody comes in and I usually know them by name, and it's, man, when it comes time to fill out the invoice, I'm always so tempted. Like I'm always like, man, maybe we can just like bring it down a little. Just, I know this guy. Well, I know, I have a clientele. My clientele list is like 400 names long, and I know a lot of them. And
Hmm.
it's so tempting to just give everybody a discount. And so there's pros and cons to that. And then there's pros and cons to the big dealership thing where you go into the dealership and there's a different person behind the counter every time, and you pay what you pay, and nobody gets butthurt about it.
Yeah, I agree. I remember years ago, my dad saying to a customer who had been dealing with us for a long time too, and it always stuck with me. This guy wanted a better deal than what he was getting, and he said, "You're my friend. Why would you give me a deal on this?" And my dad just responded and said, "You're my friend. Why would you ask me to? Why you ask me to discount my time that I have to come in here and work every day at?"
Hmm.
And he was right to a degree. If we're really friends, why are you trying to take money out of my pocket? Um,
But
and
then the
sometimes
problem
people
becomes.
may have a point. There could be shops that are overcharging on things. I don't think that's the case in the vast majority of situations. I just think it's happened in our industry for decades that we are more willing to give stuff away because, like you said, you feel a little bit bad. These people become your friends because you're all enthusiasts.
Hmm.
Um,
We go riding
that it just
together.
became the norm.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the problem becomes, well, okay, if you have to give discounts to your friends, then how many friends do you want to have?
Yeah. Well, there's a fine line when you treat this as a business. Is okay. Like I can have 500 clients, and I have to kind of give them all discount. They're asking for discounts. I have to give them here and here. Or if I just charge a fair price and I do good, fair work,
Yeah.
maybe I'm going to lose 200, but those 300 are going to pay me what I'm actually worth. So you're probably not too far off your net bottom line at the end of the year. And I think that's more the route you'll see people going in our industry because I think we are reaching a critical point where there's not as many new people willing to put in the time to gain all the experience that it takes to be somebody like yourself. And the people who have like yourself, um, you reach a point where you just don't want to get beat down on that stuff anymore. You want to do what you love and get paid fairly for it. I don't think any of us is asking for the moon.
Yeah.
Um, I think people have just become accustomed to seeing that discount.
Yeah, if you're looking to make a lot of money, the motorcycle industry is not the industry to be in.
No, and sadly, I agree with you. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, there are sacrifices in every situation. But man, I wake up in the morning, I I'm not wearing socks. Like I just come down here and you know, I have sometimes I burn my feet because I'm running my lathe in my sandals, and there are so many privileges that come with the ability to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, money is not always the end all either. Like I loved my time at Mongoose. I loved the industry.
Yeah.
Um, I wouldn't say necessarily I got forced out of it, but machining took a toll on my hands, and I eventually reached a point where I had to make a decision and leave. But by and large, I love it. I mean, I've known you for a long time, not to the same degree that I feel like we have now. But I know that you're somebody who loves it, and for people, I mean, look at the video. Like, you're not getting paid right now. I'm not getting paid right now, but I love this. I would happily
Yeah.
sit here for hours and chat with you about power sports.
Yeah.
Um,
I waste
I
so
just
much
enjoy it.
time because I love talking with my customers.
Yeah. Um, but I that makes up for sometimes what we deem a lack of money, because we do
That's
get
right.
to do something we love,
Mhm.
and not everybody can say it.
100%. It 100% does. I'm somebody who, man, if I'm not enjoying what I'm doing, I'm not motivated, and I would say that I'm useless. If I'm not by and large having a good time what I'm doing, I'm just not engaged. It's not a good situation. I have to be doing I have to be working with motorcycles because I've I've been into dirt bikes since literally as long as I can remember. And most of the people in the industry are like that.
Oh, for sure. And that's what makes it such a great group is you are that way inclined, and now you have a network of friends that feel exactly the same way.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think ultimately that breeds excellence. Like when you have people that are really into what they're doing, uh, you know, it's what I do during the day, and a lot of times it's what I do in the evening too, and on the weekend.
Mhm. Yep.
It all contributes to the hours that are put into getting super good at something.
Yeah.
Something like Nikasil, like it. I've often wondered. This was very interesting to me because I've often wondered how did this whole thing start. There's what used to be CV Tech on kind of on the East Coast, and then there's Mongoose on the West Coast, and that's mostly it. And it would have had to be somebody pretty unique to take on such a thing and build it to it what it has become.
Yeah. And I mean, when my dad first got started in plating, the Bernard family was around. So it used to be Atelier Adrian Bernard, and then became, I think it was Atelier Adrian Bernard CV Tech, and then it was just CV Tech, and then now it's Umatech. But they started that on that side of the country, and it was the dad, I think, three brothers. But they were great machinists, and they did a great job. And it took somebody like that to get that end started, and it took somebody like my dad to get this end started.
Mm.
Um, Over time, I mean, they've done a great job. They went to production faster, like to a more production based model, business
Hmm.
model, faster than what we did at Mongoose, where we tried to one off everything. And when Bernard started buying up cores so they could do an exchange program, I remember we looked at the time, we're like, no, no, like people want their own cylinder back. Nobody wants to end up with someone else's cylinder. And in the end, we were wrong. The vast majority of people wanted speed, and you got speed by doing the exchange program. So they did great stuff there. Um, the hard thing over the years, being situated where Mongoose was, is that they're 30 minutes outside of Vancouver. The real estate's expensive, wages are expensive. Where
Hmm.
CB Tech is out in,
Thetford Mines.
yes, thank you. That reminds, I think, again, going back years when I was still at Mongoose, their average wage was almost $10 an hour cheaper. So there's
Oh
different
wow.
things uh, that work in their favor to be able to offer pricing at a more competitive level. Where I wouldn't say Mongoose was not competitive on pricing, um, for any personal advantageous reasons. It was just the cost of doing business where we were, was expensive. If we could have moved to, um, like the Kootenays or northern Alberta or not northern Alberta, sorry, but like somewhere in Alberta where you're kind of off in the middle of nowhere, it'd be easier to find employees that stuck around because you'd be in a smaller town like Thetford Mines. Um, but all that just kind of worked in their favor. And again, they did a good job at what they decided to specialize in, which is the exchange program. So they could play all summer long to build up this program, because snowmobiles is huge for them, and even for Mongoose. Like, we aren't in the same snowscape that they are, but in the in the busiest times in the machine shop for Mongoose, it was always snowmobiles. That was the season. 'Cause each machine has at least two cylinders, sometimes three if it was a Yamaha. Um,
Hmm.
so when something blew up, and they're all two strokes, so when they blew up big, and you were doing cranks and three cylinders at a time,
And they
um,
want them back now.
and they want them back now. So and that's where CB Tech kind of won on the exchange program was they went that route first, and it was the ticket.
Hmm. I have one more question.
Hmm.
Um, why Mongoose? Why'd you call it Mongoose?
So my dad didn't. He bought it. So the original owner, Keith Morrow, who now owns K-Tech CNC machine shop, um, he's a great rider, but a little guy, super fast, and so he got nicknamed Mongoose one time. And when he decided to start the machine shop, that's what he called it. And so when my dad bought it, he just kept it the same.
And here we are. And
Yeah,
Mongoose has become what it is. Yeah,
yeah,
I still talk to the girls, Taylor and Brittany, all the time. Like the usually it's about recluse, or I get all my SKF seals, obviously, and all that stuff. Uh,
yeah.
and when you left, I was like, "Mm, oh, it was I was quite worried. But Taylor and Brittany are always awesome to talk to, and they're
Oh,
super
good.
man, they're super quick and super helpful. If I email them, I usually have a response back super quick. And I don't know how they I don't know how they keep all of the knowledge, the product knowledge in mind that they do, but man, they do. If I need to know something about a product that Mongoose carries, I don't know where they get it from, but they always have it. It's super good.
It, it's tough, and I mean it's tough for all shops. Like anybody in the parts side of things, again, it's another thing that sets the industry apart is it's you have to know so much, like dirt bike pistons, snowmobile pistons, outboard pistons, who manufactures them, where do you get them from, what tolerances do they run. But on the recluse side of things, it's a very unique product. You got to know a ton of stuff regarding that. When we decided to get into SKF, now you had to all of a sudden we had to learn all about suspension. Um,
Hmm.
it's a cool place. It's a cool industry to get to be a part of that. Like I remember when we took on Recluse um, back in I think it was 2008 or 2009. Um, yeah, having to dive in and learn all that stuff was super difficult because it was so unique, especially with like the original Z Start and Z Start Pro clutches.
Oh
I
yeah,
eventually just ended up going to Boise and I spent a week working at Recluse because that was the best way to go learn about it. But yeah, it's a lot to know.
yeah. I can't keep track of it. I work on recluses all the time, and when I need a part, I pull the clutch cover off and I pull the pressure plate off, and then I call Mongoose and I say, "This is kind of what I'm looking at. These are some of the numbers. What do I need?" And then they just tell me, and
Oh, good,
it works. It's perfect.
good.
Okay, well, I mean, I feel like you've answered questions in a really practical way. I feel like that's something, especially it's like an oil thread. It's really hard to nail down what is happening with Nikasil and what riders need to do with their Nikasil at home. And I I mean, I think it's I think we covered a bit of a swath. Like if there's somebody that is maybe a machinist or is doing it more regularly, you might be doing it one way. If you're somebody who is doing a top end once a year or once every 2 years, it's totally fine to clean everything up and then put it back together. If as long as you're not looking for top performance, I I feel
Yeah,
like that's really practical advice that makes a lot of sense to me.
yeah, and I think again, like there's a plethora of ways that people can to work at like maintaining the Nikasil or honing the Nikasil on their own, and there's a perfect way. And I think from the machine shop standpoint, that's what we had to stick with because you are paying for that expertise and knowledge, and so your goal is to make it perfect. But there's a
Hmm.
whole range of stuff in between that will work. Um, you just can't quantify it always. Like people say, oh, if I just put the rings in, I don't know how long will it last, and that
Mhm.
I hated that question always because there is no answer. 30 seconds, 30 hours, 30 months, I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, but if you make it perfect, I can kind of give you a better range of how long that should last. But the way
Mhm.
you're doing it, again, maybe 30 months was the answer. Maybe that'll last forever. Um,
Well, I mean, even
I'm just
that,
not
I
going to
feel
put
like,
my name behind
yeah, even if it's perfect, people ask me, probably the most popular question that I get on social media is how long can I go on a top end on whatever bike, insert whatever bike. And my usual answer is somewhere between 30 hours and 400 hours.
it.
And
Yeah, and I wish there was a better way to explain it to people that the question just isn't valid. Like it's not a question you can ask. I used to tell people that when they asked that about cylinder plating, like, well, how long will I get out of this? And like, well, if I sat there in neutral with the throttle pinned for 25 minutes straight, you get 25 minutes. But if you do all these things and you maintain your dirt bike and you're changing your air filter and you're changing your oil, yeah, you can get a long, long, long life out of this. But I don't know
you
who
do.
you are and I don't know how you maintain.
Not to mention if
It's
you're a
an
moto
impossible question.
rider or if you're a woods
Yeah,
rider or if you like, you're a farm rider, like how long is a piece of string?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
about the same question.
yeah. I
Okay.
used to hate that question.
Well, I think we should probably wrap it up there. I feel like we've covered it. We covered more than what I expected, but that's how that tends to be how conversations go in the industry, and it's meandering. It's cool. Um,
Yeah, I'm glad you reached out and happy to jump back in and get to talk power sports stuff again after being out of it for a while. But
yeah.
and I'd be happy to jump on again. You get more questions or somebody wants to jump out and say the information I gave was wrong. Happy to come chat with you or anybody.
Well, people will say that, but you know, I welcome them to back it up. If people have different opinions, that's cool. You're somebody who worked in the industry, for most of your life so far, and your dad was one of the pioneers. So I'm not sure if there's many people that have as much practical, applicable understanding, and that's why I figured you'd be a perfect person to have this conversation with. I appreciate
Yeah,
your time, big time.
no, I'm glad you reached out.